There's this thing called Dixie. What is this thing? Yeah, it's a very strange war game. It doesn't look like a strange war game. It looks like your standard hex and counter game from its era. It's got a terrible rating on Board Game Geek. It was never well received by the community in general. And I kind of question that because... So here's the thing. I didn't have a lot of fun with it. It was okay. I'm not gonna... It kind of grew on me. But the core mechanisms that it uses felt innovative to me, for its time period especially. Notably this action point concept where, and maybe something predated it, but given that it's a Redmond Simonson game, 1976, I would be very tempted to say that, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that this was kind of the first attempt at this. Given some of the other things he made, like Sorcerer after the Holocaust, and now Empires of the Middle Ages, that he has design credits on. He definitely kind of took a look at, hey, what's sort of the standard? Let me turn that on his head. And I don't know about things like Walk the Rhine, whatever. The Drive on the Rhine. Walked on Rhine, I think it is called. But I don't remember, anyway, that may be just a traditional huge war game. Maybe trying to push the limits and the boundaries of how big and complicated something can be. I'm not sure. It certainly has sounded like it's a big, complex game. But the few games that I have of his that that I've played are all very, very strange creatures. This one doesn't, like I said, it doesn't look terribly strange, but it has some intriguing ideas. Now, it has a combat chart that operates on differentials, and you pay action points to get bonuses on it, and those bonuses are absolutely vital. If you don't buy the bonuses, you're really taking a risk, and you're probably not going to do very well. So, although the actual cost of combat isn't terribly high, in terms of action points, to get an effective combat requires the expenditure of action points, and it requires quite a few to get a good chance of success. It uses something that presents results that are similar to the results in a game like the older SPI World War I, which the more you throw in terms of combat, the more damage you do to both sides. If you're trying to optimize your attrition war, you actually want like 2-to-1 on that. And similarly in this, if you want to optimize the damage that you're doing to the opponent, you want to get into a certain sweet spot here in non-affecting terrain, the +2 to +4 table, where you're going to cause damage without taking damage if you expend enough action points. As you go higher, you cause more damage and cause, but also take a little bit more damage. And you've expended a lot more action. Well, you've expended more action points to get up there on the odds table. It's just the way the game is designed, because the most strength points you can have coming from a hex is 4. Take a little look at, the components are standard SPI, especially for an S&T game, which this apparently was. The action point system, the player whose turn it is has a certain amount of points they can spend. They have to spend them on building units, on recovering their units, on moving units, on reforming their different formations, which can be very expensive, and to some extent on attacks. So basically it covers everything. And how active you're going to be in the game is determined by how many action points you have available. These are largely non-changing, although if you lose a lot of territory, your action point total each turn goes down, and you'll be in trouble for that. It reminds me of things that came out, 5 years later at Victory Games that I thought were oh so innovative, right? Now I'm looking and I'm saying, wow, that's interesting. Stuff like Gulf Strike, which I don't think worked on an action point system, but it accomplished some of the same goals. The combination of the stacking and breakdown rules, again, this is a different sort of flavor of game than I'm used to. Usually it's like, you can get so much stuff in a hex. That's not really the case here. Here, you put 2 divisions in a hex, well, you gotta have the action points to combine them into a core. And they become inherently stronger by doing that, but they cost more to move in that format, and it's painful, You can't just break them down like in Crusades and split them all over the place. Instead, there is an actual cost to forming and dispersing your army. And in fact, you could break down your units, move them to get the extra movement points, and pay. And this is something I didn't even think of, but now I do, looking at the sequence of play, and then pay to reform those divisions into a core. So you get an extra movement point that way, which might be absolutely vital. I've seen a couple of cases in the play that I did where that happened, where that extra movement point would have been a big deal. Zones of control, a little bit weird here, where armor can pass through one zone of control. I don't know how big a difference that is. That's something I think I've seen elsewhere. The rail movement is just, hey, pay more, get infinite movement, but within your own friendly territory only, and not adjacent to the enemy at all. Disruption effects, they pretty much are what you later see in something like Victory Games Civil War, which is, oh look, we fought and had to take a disruption effect, and that more or less stuns the unit. It's going to suck at combat defensively. It can't attack, and it can't move. It's got to recover from that, and the recovery is a cost, again, out of your action points, much like the initiative system in that game. I've already kind of talked about the combat itself. So, what is the gestalt of it all? I think what comes out of it is essentially one of those little, what I call competitive games, which is that you have to sit and really think about what you're going to do. First of all, there's pre-planning, which I really hate. Nothing formal, it's just to use those action points effectively, you have to really count everything and figure out everything you're going to do. I fudge a little bit with that, but you can't go too far with this, There's some matters where you just really have to kind of keep track of what you're going to need and put that aside, in your head at least, and not spend that, because you're going to need that. And then as you move units, you start saying, well, if I'm going to make that attack, I need this too that I hadn't counted on before. That becomes a little bit more flexible. It's a small list of, the action points, and it's not at all hard to keep track of. But the actual play, the fact that the action points severely limit the number of things you can do in a turn, puts it in that realm where I feel like there's a lot of room for the person who really wants to devote their thinking and their planning and to a limited sandbox and just really focus in on that, and that certain types of play will be heavily rewarded and other types won't. And there's a really deep little curve that happens at the beginning. You know, you start playing it like you would a normal war game, and you're like, well, I'll get good odds that I don't need the die roll difference or something like that. Zoning out on the chart would have helped. I kind of did a little bit, but apparently I didn't get a lot of information from that because I blundered terribly with the Union at the beginning of my game. So anyway, I think there's the kind of system, and I would point to some of the Avalon Hill classics in terms of the kind of thought that you'd apply to this, or even more so to things like Ancient Battles Deluxe, where there's a few pieces on the board and you've got this puzzle to figure out. That's a combination of geometric, the odds, your action point system, all this kind of conglomerates together, and of course the victory points, or maybe to some squad leader type scenarios. This is not the type of game that I generally really enjoy. On the other hand, as I got a little more familiar with the thinking involved in it, it became less onerous, and I would say surpasses most of those in my view, you know? And in that sense, I kind of look at it and say, you know, you've got a really clever new delivery system, packaging, whatever, of that basic problem of how do I provide a really nice tense competition between two players where they can let their you know their strategic insight and their tactics as well, in terms of like figuring out how to optimize any particular force deployment on here. They've got simple, small victory conditions that are easy to absorb. You're not looking over a whole point set. What's disappointing to me about games like that is sort of the opposite of the Dean Essig policy. Dean has stated, look, it should be obvious who won the game at the end of the game. Well, that's not the case with this. It's not the case at all. This is one where you're focused on victory points and how to get them. And it's quite possible that you might have what look like extreme conditions favoring the losing player, which I did. The Confederates had managed to invade large swaths of the Union and take away many cities, but they lost the victory conditions. And this wasn't a matter of just being blind to the victory conditions. There were legitimate reasons for the Confederates to take the moves that they did in terms of pursuing the victory conditions. That strategy did not prove to be, even though it was highly successful in appearance, it did not actually turn out to be as devastating to the Union as I thought it was going to be. Largely, hey, it was possible to fight forward in Virginia better than I thought it would be, and it was possible to grab victory, on the last turn out of nowhere. So yeah, what this does not do is it doesn't give you, some kind of great simulation. It doesn't give you some kind of story. It doesn't give you a really in detail story of what's going on. You don't feel like you're fighting the war so much as you feel like you're playing a scenario, to win. You're playing something competitive. There's very little else that you can gain out of this. And it's kind of a funny thing. A week or two ago, maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago, a discussion came up on BGG where some people were taking real offense to being considered competitive gamers, as though that meant that they would cheat, rules lawyer, whatever it is, in order to win. That's not, or just trash talking. Honestly, I think trash talking is not particularly a competitive aspect. I feel like that's sort of a mockery of the competitive gamers when people start trash talking. It's like the trash talking in wrestling. That's not really competition. It's scripted. It's similar in these kind of games. It's like you're talking a bigger game than you really are bringing to it. You don't see, highly dedicated chess or Go players sit down and start trash talking each other beforehand, but there's nothing more competitive. And no, they're not cheating, and no, they're not rubbing it in the face of the person they're competing against. They're good sports about it, usually. And granted, there is some cheating, especially in chess. I would call it cheating in the sense that you're going outside the direct experience of the game itself to make your opponent uncomfortable. Maybe you stare at them while they're taking their turn, or whatever. Whatever is going on, you find something to try to get under the other person psychologically. That's become part of chess. I don't think that's become part of Go, but maybe. And that feels kind of to be anti-competitive to me, honestly. It feels like you're going outside, it's like kicking somebody in the shins in order to win an arm wrestling competition. You're cheating in a sense. It's an acceptable form of cheating, just like, I don't know how to put that. But yeah, I mean, when I say competitive, I really mean that both players are really focused on winning and a competitive game is one which really allows, within the limits of what I consider at least human capability, or the kind of human that I am, to analyze and optimize your situation. And to me, those become kind of puzzles. Maybe moving puzzles, but it's a different flavor of something from something where there's a fair amount of luck involved, where the storyline or the simulation value is really kind of more importance than the competition itself. It becomes less a game and more of a simulation game, right? This I don't feel is truly a simulation in any sense. This is really a game, but it makes enough nods to the military aspects of it, the goals that are there, and how you'd achieve them. What it just doesn't do is there are things you can do that don't work as you'd expect. They don't help your position in the game, for example, when maybe they should. And there's no way that any board game, or computer game for that matter, anything that's a mechanistic system can ever present you with that kind of fluidity, right? A game master game, where the game master is allowed to, expected to change the rules and react to what players do, is a different kind of thing. One where you still may not be getting a good simulation because you're based on the knowledge of that game master in the position, but it allows for more opportunities and things that can be done that are a little outside. So you could be told, well, your victory conditions are to take 3 cities in the Confederacy, but that's like telling someone your goal is to get to Chicago. This is taking something from an acting class. That doesn't mean that you try to drive as fast as possible and run people over if they get in your way. There are other things that are just understood that can't be spelled out in the rules. And this game, along with most competitive games, really doesn't lend itself to that kind of nuance. On the other hand, something like OCS does, not just because of the complexity of the game and because it covers, it covers things in enough detail that you're not going to see as many unreasonable strategies. At least this is my feeling. Other people will feel differently about this, but you're not going to see as many unreasonable strategies getting you to victory. You're not going to, the game's not designed to say, oh, yep, I made a last stab and won this. A great example of this is some of the North Africa games. Desert Fox combined with Trail of the Fox, etc. Where if you're trying to win the game, you are not going to mimic history at all. You're not going to do historical things. You would have to write scripting into the game to do so, because the victory conditions are such that for the Axis, getting to Alexandria isn't even, it isn't really a viable thing that can happen. However, that was Rommel's goal, and if you're playing, you should be. My view on the simulation side of things is your strategy for the game should mimic what the real people involved were doing, and it shouldn't do it just because the game tells you must do this or else you lose, right? So it's one of the reasons I look at Unconditional Surrender and say that Unconditional Surrender Europe, which I think is a fine competitive game that shows a great deal, but has this kind of wedge in it that says you got to do these things or you lose as the Axis, even though, if you were just trying to fit the core victory conditions, you wouldn't do these things, because the victory conditions don't work to fully define. Without these special cases, which I call scripting, the victory conditions wouldn't work to get you to where you're supposed to go. Now, this is a completely speculative war, right? You could probably do some hand-wavy stuff and say, well, it wouldn't matter if the Union lost, the entire Trans-Mississippi, because the golden dingus of the Confederacy was sitting in, Richmond. Or, I don't know, if any 3 cities or 5 oil wells would give it to you, but you can't combine it any other way. You could make up mystical, magical stuff to make this work. That's not very believable in the storyline, though, and that's the problem. It makes more sense in a purely fantasy game than it would in something that's an alternate history, where you're bringing this conception of reality to play that just doesn't match. It doesn't match with the real world, so, well, it's kind of like saying something like, it's kind of in the fantasy game genre, if you kind of figure out why dragons can fly and how magic works and all this, and define that all, and certain expectations are built up, you can't just violate them on the argument of, well, it's fantasy. You could say the same here. Well, it's fantasy. The Confederacy won because they had, magic werewolves. And if the Union's able to capture the 1 per city that are in existence, or reduce their, flow of werewolf drink by enough. Nah. Anyway, I'm getting very silly here because it's very hard to talk about the game itself. The game shows itself, and you can see that in the playthrough. But my feeling with it is, and this is only, off of one play and the closeness of the game, even given a screw up, is that this is actually a really fine system and design at that highly competitive level. And that, there may be little balance issues, right? Those can be tweaked and fixed. But that this provides a different platform and a different manifold to explore your wargaminess on, on that on that competition level, and only on that competition level. You're not getting, some kind of deep insight into what armored combat was like during, or would have been like in North America, based on this. First of all, from the experience of both the American Civil War and in World War II, you would say, well, if there was such a conflicting pair of antagonists sitting there ready to go to war, they probably would gear up and have enough troops to have continuous frontiers, which this game just does not. You don't have fairly solid lines the way you do in a World War II game. But the fact that you don't is part of what lends this to a slightly different style of competition than you would see in, like, a Stalingrad, in a big East Front game. I say Stalingrad, but what I really mean there is Avalon Hill's Stalingrad, where you have a contiguous front that you can't just penetrate. Here you don't. And there's different postulations, and some of them I can disagree with, but I can at least understand where they're coming from, because they're flaws, though. Yeah, and what is the fact that I started to find it a little bit more appealing than I usually find such competitive games? I'm not sure. I think that's actually the innovation. That the fact that I'm thinking in a different way than I would even playing something that's a more modern, something like No Retreat or something that I consider a very competitive game as well. I find myself doing things that are just very different. So there's that puzzle solving of the core mechanisms and how the game is supposed to work. And that's probably why it's unappealing to a swath of players, is that they're coming in like I did with the assumptions about what a hex encounter SPI wargame from this period is going to give me, and finding that I've got a very, very different beast here, and that expectations being foiled. Well, for the most part, the games of this era, I don't know, this was the beginning of the interesting era. But yeah, a lot of the games from this era just struck me as not only dry and some of them very competitive, but also kind of uninteresting to me. The competitive nature keeps the story down, and there was a sameness to a lot of them. And here we're talking about things like the Blue and Gray series that I'm growing more fond of as I age, but somehow the simplicity is just easier to deal with. This was not that simplicity, though it might become so with a few blanks. Anyway, that's my rambling thoughts on Dixie. Cheers.